When is the earnest money deposit or EMD refundable? In this quick slideshow, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about the refundability of an earnest money deposit. All right, let's set the stage. The EMD is typically 1 to 3% deposited in escrow at the start of a transaction and then sits there. The whole point of it is not only to show good faith that the buyer's bringing money to the table, but also to have money sitting in that neutral third-party escrow account in case the buyer breaches, so the seller can be compensated for their trouble. All right, when does this scenario come into play? Well, the buyer doesn't complete the transaction for whatever reason. And the first question that a seller should ask, or agent involved when they're determining whether or not their EMD is refundable, is where the contingencies are at. Is there any buyer contingency in place? That's question number one. Number two is, can the buyer still cancel based on that contingency? Now, the big three are loan, inspection, and appraisal. Now, if one of those is in place, then the buyer can cancel. Now, naturally, one scenario that comes up or question that I hear consistently is, well, the contingency period expired. Let's say at day 17, the contingency expired and the buyer wants to cancel on day 19 or day 21. Can the seller keep the deposit because that period's expired? The answer is no. The reason is that contingencies don't automatically go away. Now, the date of when they're supposed to be removed is what is expiring, but not the contingency itself. A contingency can only be removed in writing. So sometimes I come across these sellers that don't want to send a notice to the buyer to remove the contingency, and so they wait. And they wait, and the buyer keeps telling them that they're going to remove their contingency the next day, the next day, the next day. This can go on for days. I've seen it go on for weeks before. And then finally the seller says, that's it, I've had enough. You have not removed your contingency, and we're canceling and taking your deposit. Well, they can't. Now, a seller can cancel, and I'll explain on the next slide how, but the seller can't just take the deposit just because the contingency was never removed and the buyer goes on and on. The contingency stays in effect and protects the buyer's deposit even after the expiration date. All right. So what does the seller need to do? Well, if the contingency is not removed, the seller sends a notice to the buyer to perform. That's the car form NBP, notice of buyer to perform. And that task to perform is the contingency removal. Then the seller must wait 2 days. So if it's Monday and the seller sends this to the buyer, notice to perform, and says, hey, remove all your contingencies, thereby making your deposit non-refundable. Well, the buyer has 2 days to do it. So now the seller sent it on Monday. Now the seller waits Tuesday and Wednesday. It's not till Thursday morning that the seller can cancel. Just explaining how this timeline works. It gets mixed up a lot. So notice to a buyer to perform to remove a contingency. Now, if the buyer doesn't remove the contingency after that 2-day waiting period, the seller can cancel. But the seller cannot keep the EMD. It's still refundable to the buyer because the buyer never removed the contingency. So the seller can cancel the transaction, but they're not keeping the deposit. I put DCE on this slide because that's a demand to close escrow. It's the same thing as a notice to perform, except the notice to perform is to remove contingencies during the transaction. The demand to close is at the very end. It's a demand to close. And instead of a 2-day waiting period, it's a 3-day waiting period. So 3 days out, the seller can say, hey, buyer, close escrow. Now, if the buyer doesn't, the seller can cancel. Now, does the seller get to keep the deposit? It depends. Were contingencies removed or not? That's the determining factor. If they were completely removed and the seller cancels with a demand to close escrow, the seller is contractually obligated or entitled to the deposit. Of course, this can change depending on how you fill out the RPA, but I'm just speaking in terms of a default RPA. If I pulled one out of a stack of purchase agreements, this is how it would be filled out. This is what's typical and customary. So now if the buyer never removed contingencies and the seller sends a demand to close escrow, well, the seller's not going to get the deposit because there are still contingencies protecting the buyer's deposit. So then what happens? Well, let's say the buyer removed all contingencies and the seller sent a notice to perform or a demand to close escrow. Well, the seller should say, hey, I need the deposit. Now, here's the problem. The deposit sits in escrow until both parties sign instructions. And you should check out my other video on cancellation of contract form. This is very important. I go into depth on this topic. But the bottom line is escrow needs both parties' signatures. Well, here's the problem. When a seller sends a demand to close and the buyer doesn't, and the buyer breaches, guess what? The buyer doesn't want to cooperate. They say, I want my deposit back. And the seller will say, no, you're not entitled to it. So then what happens when there's a stalemate like that? Well, dispute resolution. What's the first step? Now, typically on the RPA, of course, all these are subject to being modified because you can modify an RPA basically any way you want. But by default, likely mediation is the first course of action. So one party is going to send demand to go to mediation to the other, and they go to mediation and try to hash it out. If that doesn't work, the RPA stipulates that they go to arbitration. And then there's an arbitration award, which is legally binding and can be given to escrow to release the deposit. And if that doesn't happen, then maybe one party takes another party to court or small claims court, or they just hire an attorney. For going after deposit, you probably want to just find an inexpensive attorney because the contract is going to clearly define who's entitled to it. And you don't need some top-notch trial attorney or something, going to bat for you. Just find some budget attorney that knows what they're doing and send them to court to get your deposit. And that's it. Because again, just to clarify, the escrow needs either mutually signed instructions to release the deposit or a court order / arbitration award. So you need one of those two things. Only then can escrow disperse the deposit back to the party entitled to it through the mutually signed instructions or the court order. That's it. If you have questions, leave a comment. Check out the cancellation of contract car form video. And if you're interested in 100% commission, we have $49 a month, no transaction fee, E&O insurance included. Check out the link in the description. Thanks so much for watching.